My name is Zach Finn, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Seward House Museum. And today's talk is titled Grounds of Expansion, the Seward Surveys of New York's Natural History. And we're going to be talking about the 1836 to 1842 geological surveys about the state, which eventually, due to his fervent support, earned the nickname the Seward Surveys. Today's lecture is really going to focus on the economic and political components of these surveys and how Seward utilizes them throughout his career. That being said, there's a lot of very interesting secondary sources that really dive in deep to the scientific discoveries being made, as well as the history of the scientists themselves. So at the end of this lecture, I've included a bibliography for those of you who might be more interested in learning about the scientists who are actually responsible for carrying out the surveys. But with that, before we dive into the 19th century history, let's take a snapshot look at New York State in the 21st century. In 2017, New York State agriculture generated a revenue that produced over $5.75 billion. That same year, according to the USDA agricultural census, there were over 33,000 farms in New York State, and similarly, over 6 million acres dedicated to agricultural production. And farms alone employ over 55,000 people, with the agricultural industry as a whole, if you include production, creating more than 200,000 jobs. So this is kind of a roundabout way of saying that agriculture has become really critical to New York State's economy. Similarly, the state has invested in the sciences. And let me preface this list could have gone on, and I tried to keep it short. But when you look at New York State and its relationship with the sciences, you have Cornell University, which is linked to the Paleontological Research Institute, which is linked to the Museum of the Earth in Ithaca. You have Columbia University, the New York State Geological Association, SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. If you're watching this from Auburn or from Cuyahoga County, in your backyard in Syracuse, you have the most. And of course, you've got the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, where you can come face to face with the blue whale when you step into the Ocean Hall. So New York's got a pretty intimate relationship with the sciences as well. And then lastly, New York State's got some pretty amazing places you can visit. Here you can see my dog Bruce, completely enamored by Taganic Falls in Ithaca. A little bit closer to Auburn, you've got Fillmore Glen in Moravia. We've got the Adirondacks in the northeast section of the state, and in the southeast section of the state, of course, you've got the Catskills. So there's a lot of amazing natural places to visit throughout New York. And again, this is all kind of a roundabout way of stating that New York State has developed an important scientific and agricultural community that exists till today, and also contains some unique and interesting natural sites as well. So with that snapshot of New York as it is today, now we can kind of dive into the history and look at the legacy of Seward's involvement in these geological surveys that kind of leads to where we're at as a state today. To the right, you'll see something that I'm sure is very familiar to you, a map of New York State, and contained within are the 4 geological districts as they're partitioned out in 1836 and 1837. And these geological districts are going to be extremely important when we look at the surveys. Now, before we dive into what the geological surveys or the Seward surveys are specifically, let's look at a quote from Seward taken from 1842. This is when his second term as governor is coming to an end. And Seward states, "Nature has written her own annals on the globe we inhabit." So clearly Seward is talking about geology here. And this is, again, at the end of his second term as governor of New York. And he had dedicated the past several years to being involved in the geological research that is happening throughout his state. So now we can kind of define what the Seward surveys were exactly. So the Seward surveys were the New York geological surveys carried out from 1836 to 1842. And these include surveys that extend beyond just geology. There are field workers and scientists studying the zoology, the botany, and the paleontology of the state. Now, it is important to note that in 1836, Seward was not governor at the time. So when the first bill was passed that eventually developed support for these surveys, it was actually Seward's predecessor, William Marcy, who was governor at the time. William Marcy supports the legislation, which was created to develop the surveys, but it was Seward's fervent support that earns them the nickname the Seward Surveys. Initially, the field workers would compile annual reports on their findings to present to the assembly. And from there, these annual reports and the research that is conducted by these scientists would be published in over 30 volumes, which extend well past Seward's time as governor of New York, and have been described as the Epochal Survey of New York by historian Samuel Resnerek, who writes an excellent article on the emergence of a scientific community in New York, which again, I'll link in the biography at the end there. Now, a little bit into the political background of what leads to Seward becoming governor of New York. Now, William Marcy, who is able to support the bill that eventually leads to funding for these geological surveys, is going to be the last governor who belonged to the Albany Regency. He finds himself in trouble with the public in 1837, which kind of sets up the arena for William Henry Seward to step in and win the governorship. Now, this was Seward's second attempt at becoming governor of New York. He had originally run in 1834, didn't perform very well, it proved disastrous. In fact, he even lost his own Cayuga County. But when he runs in 1834, there is one area of the state that he does well in, and we'll talk about that later in the lecture. What ends up happening is in 1837, there is a national panic, and it hits New York as well. And there grows to be a general discontent towards both Marcy and the Albany Regency, which is a bit of a Jacksonian-aligned political machine operating in New York, favors small government and kind of the natural ebb and flow of the market, which, when the Panic of 1837 strikes, Seward is running to become governor of New York at this point, and he points to several of Marcy's inactions as governor of New York to say that, as governor of New York, William Marcy kind of compounded the impact of the Panic of 1837. So what ends up happening is Seward is elected governor, and I'm sure you can already start to kind of piece the pieces of the puzzle together here. Seward is interested in infrastructure. He wants to unroll a series of sweeping social reforms. He wants railroads. He wants canal improvements, educational services, prison reform. He wants New York State to become a haven for European immigrants that are making their way to the United States. So we're just calling for a lot of kind of grand sweeping social reforms. And he lays all of these out in his inaugural address when he's becoming governor of New York. But it's during this inaugural address, Seward makes a comment that ties in directly to the geological surveys that were in the process of happening. Seward notes, with irony, that mankind learned the distances and laws of planets and even periods of comets before they conceived the mysteries of vegetation. What Seward goes on to argue is that New York State needs to invest in the sciences that are going to help agriculture and help understand the natural resources of the state. So along with eventually supporting the geological surveys that are underway, Seward also is involved in the formation of the State Board of Agriculture, or pushing for the formation of the State Board of Agriculture. And then during his inaugural address, Seward pays tribute to DeWitt Clinton. And Seward and Clinton didn't always see eye to eye. In fact, Seward was initially against the building of the canal, thinking it was going to bankrupt the state, which history proves that very wrong quickly. But the last part of Seward's inaugural address is pushing for a statue of DeWitt Clinton to be built in the state's capital of Albany. And that's an interesting little footnote because you see Seward kind of carrying out the scientific and political relationship, the same concepts that are so evident in DeWitt Clinton's own political career. Seward kind of echoes a lot of those same ideologies throughout his time as governor of New York. So that's kind of the political context that sets up Seward's support for the geological surveys. He's pushing for sweeping social reforms. He wants New York State to take advantage of its resources. And as we'll talk about later, Seward is a bit of an intellect himself. Seward has a very, very curious mind. He's always looking to learn new things. So this becomes, kind of the perfect tool for these reforms that Seward is looking to carry out. Now, I'm not going to read this whole wall of text to you, don't worry, but I wanted to include this in here because this lists some of the important scientists who are going to be involved with actually carrying out the field work that results in the geological surveys. And again, this is a lecture that is admittedly very Seward-centric, so I did want to make sure to include their names throughout. You see such important figures as Emmons, Conrad, James Hall, who would really help define geology and paleontology in not only New York State, but really in the United States during this time. But following the completion of the geological surveys in 1842, what ends up happening is they pull together a series of publications. Initially, as you can see kind of in this bolded section here, the results of this survey appear in 13 large quarto volumes and 8 collections of specimens of animals, plants, soils, minerals, rocks, and fossils found within the state. And this whole overview of the introduction to the geologic surveys, or the Seward Surveys, is taken from Seward's Notes on New York, which goes on to serve as the introduction for the first volume of this publication. So Seward is very much involved in the geological surveys from basically when it starts till when it's completed. And we're going to talk about his relationship, how he's working with the scientists, and how he's using these to complete his own political ambitions and goals. Now, in this list of scientists here, again, it is kind of important to note, when Seward steps into his role as governor, William Marcy had already supported the bill. The legislature had passed it that supports the geological surveys of the state from 1836 to 1840. Now, just as critical as then Governor Marcy's support of the bill is a passionate plea from Marcy's acting Secretary of State, who argues for an allotment of $106,000 to carry out the geological surveys. After those initial 4 years, Seward was able to support 2 more years of the survey as they carried on, and an additional $26,000. I remember when I first looked at that number, $106,000 in 1836. I thought that was a pretty impressive amount of money for the state to invest in the geological surveys. But you have to remember that these are all experts in their field. They are traveling constantly. This is over 4 years. So at the end of the day, these scientists, these field workers are not being paid very much. And in fact, a lot of them have to give constant lectures. They have to end up selling artifacts and specimens that they collect throughout their travels because they are frankly being criminally underpaid for the work that they're carrying out. But still, $106,000 in 1836, right before a financial panic, it's a pretty good amount of money. And the big question that kind of develops from that is, why did the state want to invest in these geological surveys? And then after that, why did Seward want to continue on to invest more money throughout his time as governor? And the initial answer to that question is economical geology. And this is a phrase that Seward used constantly throughout the speeches that he's giving when he's talking about the surveys. For economical geology, I'm sure you can figure it out. It's basically taking the geology, the geologic discoveries, the natural resources that are being found throughout the state, figuring out a way to make money off of them. And for Seward, this is closely linked to improving state infrastructure. With the discoveries of these natural resources, Seward would then be able to justify increasing railroads, canal improvements, making sure that people who work in agriculture would have access to these resources. So very early on, you see the geological surveys being linked to agriculture and improvement of state infrastructure. And the big thing that they were initially looking for was coal. Seward states in 1842 during an extra session as governor of New York that the enterprise thus consummated, so again, the start of the geological surveys, originated in a merely economical desire to explore our mountains in search of coal. They were hoping to find coal in the Adirondacks, and this doesn't end up happening. But still, they make a litany of discoveries that certainly justify the geological surveys. And in fact, the fact that they didn't discover coal didn't end up being the worst thing in the world. Seward's close friend and publisher, James Derby, writes in his own autobiography that without the geological surveys, without kind of a conclusive proof that coal didn't exist in this region, the state would have likely funded surveys searching for coal over the next several decades. So the fact that the geological surveys kind of provided a conclusive answer prevented the state from investing too much money in trying to find coal in this region. And again, there is a litany of discoveries that these researchers make as they're traveling throughout the state. here you see a quick list of them that Seward mentions in one of his speeches. Discovery of rich deposits of salt, lime, marl, which we'll talk about on the next slide, peat, which we'll also talk about, gypsum, plumbago, zinc, lead, and iron, the field within which economic science has recently pursued its investigations, with results so well calculated to exalt. So throughout the geological surveys, they're making discoveries of natural resources for the state that the state or independent contractors would then be able to mine and obviously help improve the economy of the state. But there's other discoveries they're making throughout the geological surveys, which become very important to the economic and in a lot of ways kind of the political setup of the state. And before I jump into this quote and this picture, some of the things that the researchers were conducting throughout the geological surveys, James Hall, again, very important geologist and paleontologist if you're looking at the history of science in New York State, assembles a team that address issues of canal improvements. This team finds that faulty construction material originally used had cost the state over $1 million. He also recommends that farmers experiment with marl for increased crop production. And this was all after Hall had already studied Archibald McIntyre's iron deposits and gathered minerals for sale and trade. So James Hall, this is from, I believe, the third report that he pulls together, is involved with canal improvements. He's involved with suggestions for farmers to improve crop production, and he's working with iron deposits. And those iron deposits are especially important for the northern section of the state, where iron production will quadruple over the next 10 years. So already you can start to see the practical benefits of the geological surveys. Similarly, W.W. Mathers, in his 4th annual report on the first geologic district of the state, reaches out to farmers and asks them to consider using peat for fuel and manure, going as far as stating in this report that he's presenting to Seward, that in order to set this matter in a proper light and enable our farmers to profit by the experience of others, again, making sure that the farmers of New York State are leading to increased crop production, he pulls together letters from researchers and farmers from other states arguing for the use of peat for fuel and manure. So these scientific researchers who are studying the geology, the zoology, the botany, the paleontology of the state are always closely linking their findings to the agricultural community. Now for Seward, all of these findings are perfect because Seward wants to discover these statewide resources, and he wants to find a way to increase the state's infrastructure, specifically opening up the northern portion of the state and the western portion of the state. And that western section of the state, Seward was very familiar with. Before his time as governor of New York, Seward had worked as a land agent for the Holland Land Company, spending some time out kind of by Buffalo, Batavia on the western side of the state. So he's very familiar with the natural resources there. In 1839, Seward, and this is during his career as governor, Seward visits the northern section of New York for 2 weeks to try and learn about the land, its resources, and the economic potential that could be developed. So these scientists are closely linking their findings to things that will benefit farmers and the agricultural community. Seward is trying to increase infrastructure so that farmers, people who could benefit from access to natural resources, would be able to utilize these in their businesses. So very much working kind of in tandem and together to make sure that this benefits the economy of the state. Now, the reason that you see this picture of the tree here is that in the same year that Seward is traveling to the northern section of the state to learn about the resources, kind of interesting discovery happens. They discover mulberry trees, which are a favorite food of silkworms that could grow in northern soils. So Seward describes, and I apologize, my Latin is non-existent, Morus multicalis fever. Basically, people are getting very excited about the potential of having silkworms in northern New York, which saw farmers rush to plant the tree in efforts of establishing what was sure to be a lucrative silk trade in New York. Obviously, this never ends up happening, but that little kind of footnote into the geological surveys shows the practical relationship between what the researchers are finding and how quickly farmers are looking to make money off of it. the mulberry trees are discovered in the north, and within that year, farmers are already trying to farm mulberry trees in hope to produce silk. And that kind of serves as a perfect segue into this rather self-aggrandizing and kind of condescending quote that's pulled from Seward's writings. Seward was writing about his role in the geological surveys, how he operates both with the scientific community, how he applies it to politics and his own vision. And Seward writes that savants and philosophers are proverbially careless of matters of detail in ordinary life and business. The governor's methodical habits occasionally saved the scientific gentlemen of the geological surveys from censures, which, though unmerited, would probably have been made. His calls for them for precise accounts and regular reports were at first thought unreasonable, but they soon came to see the wisdom of such actions. Again, a little bit of a condescending comment to make when these field workers are working night and day to pull together these surveys and are being, vastly underpaid for their effort. But there is a little bit of truth there. What Seward does is Seward is able to operate both with the scientific community and the discoveries they're making, as well as making sure that information is disseminated to the general public. Seward is the perfect middleman for that position. And it's important because Seward needs to eventually justify more funding for the geological surveys in 1840. Seward argues that the encouragement of agriculture by a more general dissemination of the sciences which it employs has been the subject of frequent recommendations from this department. And we saw some examples of this. The researchers are giving farmers suggestions on how to lead to increased crop production. And of much discussion in the legislature, the geological surveys may be regarded as laying the foundation for institutions for popular instructions in these sciences, and I confidently anticipate that it will not only develop the mineral resources of the state, but it will secure the agriculture its rightful consideration and influence. So that's kind of where Seward is. Seward is in the middle ground, taking the information from the scientists who are in the field and making it applicable to both the governing bodies of the state, but also making sure that the agricultural community benefits from it as well. And in 1840, Seward is able to get the state assembly to support $26,000 more to carry out 2 more years of the geological research. Now, kind of the whole concept of economical geology, right? The fact that geology could be utilized, the discovery of natural resources could be used to support the state's economy, kind of describes Seward as Seward the state builder. Seward as increasing infrastructure, making sure that the state's agriculture continues to increase and becomes an important economic component. This is Seward as governor, really helping to build up the state. But there's another side of Seward, which is, I think, probably more important to the geological surveys than necessarily his ability to make sure to connect farmers and the New York State public to the economic resources that the state provides. I mean, the realities are the geological surveys were in place when Seward stepped into his role as governor. No matter what, someone was going to find a way to make money off of them. So it's kind of this next side of Seward that is most important, and I think which he deserves a lot of credit for. And that's Seward the intellectual. For anyone who tuned into last week's live stream lunch lecture, you got to hear Jeff's lecture about Seward's involvement in the intellectual community, about Seward as an intellectual himself. And much of what Jeff was talking about kind of applies to the geological surveys as well. Here you see a speech, which I'm going to read before giving you the historic context, but Seward states, "The truth may be fairly stated thus, that in the science of government and laws, and in eloquence, our statesmen and jurists are equal to any of their contemporaries." So here Seward is arguing that in understanding government, in producing voters and democratic population, that the United States is equal to any of its contemporaries. So far, so good. But then he continues, "In other departments, and especially those of pure science and in varied literature of the age, as well as fine arts, our scholars are vastly inferior to those of Europe." Sorry, I added the vastly, are inferior to those of Europe. So Seward is giving the speech in 1837 when he's running for governor of New York. And on its own, it's a bit of a scathing review, but if he's giving this to a lecture at a college or at a political rally, you might be able to understand it. But Seward is actually delivering this speech, which is then published as Discourse on Education, delivered in Westfield, July 16th on 1837. He's basically giving this speech at an elementary graduation. So perhaps not reading the room, perhaps not the right audience. You can almost imagine several very unhappy teachers in attendance at that lecture. Seward goes on to argue throughout this lecture, which again is at an elementary graduation. He goes on to continue to deride the quality of the curriculum being taught to students. He highlights the fact that for most American students during this time, when they finally start to actually learn, they end up entering the workforce, so they're missing out on a critical age spent in the classroom. And he really goes on about the lack of accessible texts on such subjects as science. He continues to argue that the sciences were a vital, yet neglected component of education. This is in 1837. So again, right before he steps into the position as governor of New York. And Seward looks to tackle this issue throughout his time as governor. One of those social sweeping reforms he wants to make is an improvement in education. And Seward ends up linking the geological surveys with these educational reforms. But Seward is also involved his own in meeting with the field workers. Again, taken from one of his personal writings, his sympathy when talking about Seward's career as governor, his sympathy in the work was not limited to the public messages, but was manifested in a cordial and hearty cooperation with the savants in their labors. He invited them to his house for frequent consultations, severally or collectively, audited and facilitated their accounts, advised as to preparation of their work for publication. So Seward was constantly meeting with the scientists and the field workers who were actually carrying out the geological surveys. Remember, in 1837, right before he becomes governor of New York State, Seward is arguing that the United States education system needs to catch up with European countries when it comes to the sciences. And Seward looks to accomplish this in several different ways. First of all, the study of geology and paleontology was kind of being was becoming a chance for American academics to catch up during this time and even surpass their European counterparts. So for Seward, this is a fairly newer field of study and it's just beginning to be quantified. You have people carrying out surveys throughout the United States, even before the New York State Geological Surveys. But this is a way Seward sees for American academics to catch up to their peers. And for Seward, this is important. Seward at times is extremely competitive with Great Britain. In 1833, he ends up taking a trip with his father, Samuel Swayze Seward, to visit Europe, kind of a European tour, father and son. And in Seward's autobiography, he notes his impression of British cultural sites. Specifically, he talks about the superiority of the British scientific institutions and charities. He mentions this in his autobiography. It stands out to him that the British museums, the charities, their scientific institutions far outweigh what are in the United States in 1833. When he's writing his autobiography, 40 years has passed since this initial visit to Europe. And you can almost picture him gleefully writing these words, that they have no such superiority now. So Seward feels like in this 40-year span, the United States catches up to its European counterparts in the study of sciences. And both of those quotes come from his autobiography. Along with the kind of scientific discoveries being made by the geologic surveyors, Seward happily promotes their public display. In notes, which I'll talk about on the next slide, Seward writes with satisfaction that several of the collected specimens went on to be displayed in a museum of natural history, housed in the capital of the state. And this is kind of the conversation that was happening between the researchers and Seward. In both the third and fourth annual reports, the surveyors and the lead geologists and scientists who are carrying out the research are actually pushing Seward. They write it in their annual report to develop a place for them to store and properly collect their specimens. And this does end up happening in the second story of the old state building initially, and it ends up moving around a couple times. But eventually, from the geological surveys, they actually start housing some of the specimens that are found. And again, from kind of earlier in the talk, there's a series of publications that happen following the geological surveys that ends up spanning around 30 books in total. And Seward is looking to make these publications accessible to the public as a whole. Following the eventual publication of those 30 volumes, which extend well past Seward's time as governor of New York, and these become more involved by the scientists who are actually carrying out the surveys and their research. Seward kind of aspired to a form of trickle-down approach when he's looking at the education and how to use the geological surveys to connect to the public as a whole. And this could be a little bit difficult. At one point, James Hall, the scientist who is carrying out some of the geological research, complains that thousands of copies were to be distributed to the ordinary citizens of New York State. And as such, he had to expand on fossil descriptions to make them useful to laypersons, which was difficult to do. He ends up in total throughout his life, sorry, let me check my notes here. Might be on the next slide, but James Hall ends up producing basically 13 monstrous books on the paleontology of the state. And a lot of that is trying to make it a little bit more accessible to the layperson who might not be familiar with it. But these publications, Seward pushed for so that people could research about the geological discoveries and the natural history of the state. Similarly, Seward also pushed for the school district public library, in which you can see two titles to the left here, and a quote from Derby in which he said, "Booksellers throughout the state of New York became very much interested in the passage by legislative measure in the year 1841 relative to libraries for public schools, which had been recommended by Governor Seward." So Seward was pushing for the creation of almost a curriculum where someone could self-educate themselves. He wanted these donated to the public schools. Ends up being over 200 titles. And if you visit the Seward House Museum, you're able to see a complete collection when you first step into the drawing room to the right beneath the picture of Gus Seward. But Seward ends up kind of combining the geological research being carried out by the surveyors with his love of educational reform. And when you look in the school district library that Seward ends up producing and supporting, if you look at text number 86, you'll find elements of geology for popular use. And then continued throughout the series are several different scientific titles. So again, kind of addressing those issues that Seward mentions in his 1837 speech, hoping that by pulling together a curriculum that includes science, that American students can begin to catch up with their European counterparts. And in these school district libraries, if you were to open up one of the books, in the very front, there's an inscription that says William H. Seward, which of course his name, and a little note that said this series was a project initiated by Governor Seward. So throughout Seward's career as governor, he really does kind of approach the geological surveys to make sure that they're accessible to the public as a whole. Not only do you have the annual reports, which Seward is using to argue before state government bodies to find more funding for the surveys, but also making sure that the information is disseminated to the political entities. From there, you see Seward supporting the publication of the immediate findings, which Seward actually authors the introduction from with Notes of New York. Again, we'll talk about that on the next slide. But then even with these kind of more general publications, Seward goes a step farther and makes sure that they're included in the curriculum that he pulls together for the school district public library. So you can kind of see Seward making sure that the geological surveys and their findings really are accessible to the New York State public as a whole. And here we can see a letter written from Frances Seward, Seward's wife, to her sister Lizette in June 26, 1842. Again, kind of as Seward's career as governor is beginning to come to an end, where Frances states that he's very busy writing for the Geological Survey, and I believe studying geology has grown many additional specimens. So Frances is writing about Seward's involvement throughout his career. And the writing that she's referring to is actually Seward's Notes on New York, which goes on to serve as an introduction to the first volume of those publications that are pulled together following the completion of the geological surveys. It's kind of Seward's attempt to mimic Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which was an all-inclusive history and kind of study of the state. So Seward is looking to apply that same kind of methodology to the empire state. So Seward goes on to write the introduction to the Geological Surveys, and along with those specimens that Francis mentions, Derby writes in 50 Years or More, his autobiography, that during Mr. Seward's administration as governor, the legislation also enacted a law on his recommendation to establish a depository for the preservation of specimens illustrative of the natural history of the state. So Seward is very much invested not only in the publication, but also kind of the establishment of almost an early museum for the findings of the artifacts and the specimens pulled together by the scientists. And to conclude Seward's involvement in the Geological Surveys, before we go on to how it influences the rest of his political career, here's a quote from Seward in 1841. This would have been just after they had received the additional $26,000 to support the final kind of stretch of the surveys that needed to be carried out. Seward states that the final report of the geologists will be submitted at the next session of the legislature, and inasmuch as it will exhibit a full view of zoology, botany, mineralogy, and geology of the state of New York, it will be a nobler tribute to science than any which has yet been offered in our country. Again, kind of when Seward is writing in his autobiography about the United States having caught up with Europe, you can almost see him giving this speech with like gleeful pride at the hard work carried out by the surveyors, about the increase in access to natural resources that the state was already starting to see. This very much ties into Seward's ambitions and goals as a governor of New York. But now we're going to look at how he applies the lessons he learns here to the rest of his career. So following his time as governor of New York, Seward goes on to serve as a United States Senator. And then from there, he of course becomes Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration, and finally serves a term in the Johnson administration as well. And kind of wrapping up the lesson he learns in 1842, Seward was speaking before the state senate, again as his second term as governor came to a close, and writes that progressive physical improvement, comprehending the north as well as the south, the east and the west, opening every necessary channel and disclosing every resource which nature has bestowed, is emphatically the policy of the state. And we are required to return to the course we have left by every consideration of duty to ourselves, to posterity, to our country, and to mankind. So you can already kind of see where this is going if you're familiar with Secretary of State William Henry Seward and kind of his territorial ambitions. This gleaming knowledge from resources, kind of territorial expansion is very much applied during Seward's second term as Secretary of State, and of course with the eventual Seward's Folly. So I don't want to step too much on Jeff's toes here because his last lecture really did an excellent job talking about Seward's involvement with the Alaska Treaty and kind of how he utilizes his network and the resources that he pulled together to gain support for Alaska. But we are going to look at some parallels between that and the Geological Surveys. So here we see Seward working with Edward D. Stoeckel to finish the signing of the Alaska Treaty, which sells the Alaskan territories from Russia to the United States for $7.2 million. Again, when you visit this museum, this is one of the paintings that you'll see sitting in the dining room. But Seward is interested in territories outside of just Alaska. At one point, he's looking to figure out a way to purchase Greenland and Iceland. And when he's kind of figuring out the best way to approach this territorial expansion and these purchases, he ends up sending out Benjamin Mills Pierce to write a report on the resources that both Iceland and Greenland have. And in Pierce's report, he notes that the rocks and geology of Greenland, as before stated, besides the valuable coal discovered, indicate vast mineral wealth. And this report is compiled for Seward as he's trying to figure out a way to disseminate this information to the public. And it's certainly not as comprehensive as what is pulled together in the Survey of New York, but it paints a promising picture of both Iceland and Greenland as lands with economic potential and kind of a need for further research. Now after that, of course, kind of going back to Seward's Folly, Seward ends up purchasing Alaska from Russia. And after doing that, Seward launches a massive campaign to gain support in the Senate, which ends up getting voted through But for a time, it's certainly up in the air. But just as importantly as the campaign that he pulls out using dining room diplomacy to gain support within the Senate, he's looking to sway public opinion in support by using media and publication of the purchase of the Russian possessions in North America by the United States. And this publication would be distributed broadly about, and in one of Jeff's articles, he describes it better than I could ever, so I'm just going to pull it word for word, as an omnibus of facts about timber, minerals, climate, fisheries, fur, and other resources. So here you see Seward basically using the blueprint of what the Geological Surveys of New York had created and applying that information dissemination for territorial expansion into Alaska. Following that, he orders, following the purchase of Alaska, he ends up ordering a revenue cutter, which was carrying Smithsonian-affiliated scientists to make a trip to Alaska. And from there, he takes their findings, pairs them with other additional resources, and compiles a 380-page report on the natural resources of Alaska. Again, very similar to those publications that ends up being created after the Geological Surveys of New York. And then lastly, kind of while this report was introduced to Congress, Seward utilized the media, most notably the New York Commercial Advertiser and New York Times, which were run by his close friends and political affiliates, Thurlow Weed and Henry Raymond, to highlight the economic potential that Alaska has. These newspapers highlighted the prospect of fishing and whaling, along with the oppressive amounts of natural resources which existed in the North. It's really kind of Seward at his best. Seward is able to connect the public by using newspapers. He's able to make sure that people who are looking to become even more informed have the publication, the purchase of Russian possessions in North America. He's working with political bodies. He's working with scientists, very similar to what Seward ended up doing with the Geological Surveys of New York State. And to kind of wrap this all up, well, Seward is most remembered for his ability to purchase the Alaska territories and his time as Secretary of State during the Lincoln administration. A lot of the lessons he learns as governor of New York are kind of echoed throughout that subsequent national and international political career that he has. And when you look at the Geological Surveys, with Seward kind of acting in the middle ground as both being familiar with the scientists who are carrying out the field work, with the state's population and kind of the economic goals of many of his voters and the political bodies themselves. Seward is that perfect middle person to connect all three together, kind of serving as the pipeline between the experts, the public, and the political realities of the time. So that concludes my lecture. If you're interested in a more kind of in-depth dive, a little bit of a shameless self-plug here, if you go to the New York History Review website and you check out their online publication, you can see an article I wrote about this very same topic with the same title. Similarly, as promised, here is that bibliography for those of you who are interested in learning more about the scientific discoveries or the scientific community that was involved in the Geological Surveys of the state. If you are strapped for time and can only read one of these, I highly recommend Samuel Resnick's, and I'm sorry the video is blocking this out, The Formation of the Scientific Community in New York State, a Century, and again, I can't see it. It's a phenomenal article, does a great job, starts with DeWitt Clinton, and kind of looks at the role that scientists have in being involved in kind of the political realities of the state, how these two fields are intertwined, and oftentimes how it's difficult for scientists to find themselves untwining, I guess, the political realities that they find themselves involved in. Fisher's Laudable Legacy, available online, another great article I highly recommend. But definitely make sure, if you're interested, check out these secondary sources. For anyone who has any recommendations, who has any questions, feel free to contact me by email at outreach@sewardhouse.org.